Welcome everyone to our workshop today here for applications of team science. I'll just give a quick overview of the Office of Research Development before I hand it over to our presenters. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with us, we're the Office of Research Development. Our focus is supporting faculty as they work to obtain extramural funding. We do this through a variety of ways, including workshops such as the one we offer here today. We have a whole series for the 2022-2023 academic year, so be sure to check that out on our website. We have the full schedule there. We also offer one-on-one and group coaching, external access to external consultants for proposal review and things of that nature. Team building, and as well as proposal development and grant editing services. We primarily focus on larger funding opportunities. And if you have any questions about that or would like to get more information about what we focus on, feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to answer any questions that any of you may have. A little bit about our team. We're headed by the Associate Vice President for Research, Dr. Sheila Cotton. Our team leader is Jane Jacoby, who works on proposal and grant development primarily. I'm Morgan Simpson. Apologies, I didn't introduce myself at the beginning, but here we are now. I'm Morgan Simpson. I'm a research development specialist with the department, with the Office of Research Development. And our program manager is Brett Levi, who administers the limited submission funding opportunities as well as the R initiatives. So some resources that are available to you, which can all be found on our website. We have an archive of past workshops that have been offered. So if you can look at our past events page and look at the recordings there and maybe find something that we're not currently offering in this academic year. Perhaps we've offered it in a past year and you can look those up. We offer proposal development and editing services, which on our webpage, there is a link to contact us about those opportunities. We offer early career academies, which one is coming up very soon. Next week, we've got another workshop on the NSF career program and the career academy that ORD offers in the that is run by our team leader, Jane Jacoby. So if you're interested in learning about that, that's a great opportunity to get an overview of both, the NSF career program as well as the career academy that our department offers. We also administer our initiative funding opportunities. They were reviewed at our first workshop about a month ago. That recording has been posted on our website. So if you'd like to get the most recent sort of update on what our initiatives are being offered this year, I would highly recommend you go check that out. And then finally, we're working on a repository of past proposals that faculty have submitted in order for, if you'd like to see examples of past submissions or parts of proposals that maybe you're not sure about, that'll be a resource that is coming soon to faculty. And like I mentioned, our next workshop is next week. Be sure to go to our website if you're interested, and the link to register for that workshop will be on our current events page. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce our presenters for today, Dr. Marissa Shuffler and Dr. Allison Traylor, who will be talking to us about the applications of team science. So with that, I will yield the floor to you.
Great. Thank you, Morgan. Sorry, everyone. I could not manage sharing my screen and unmuting at the same exact time. Marissa and I are very excited to be here today. I am an assistant professor in the psychology department. My research centers on teamwork and diversity and inclusion in organizations and kind of the intersection of those topics. So thinking about how we facilitate effectiveness working in teams where people are different from one another on a variety of characteristics. And before I move on, I'll let Marissa introduce herself as well.
Thanks, Allison. Hi, everyone. I am Marissa Shuffler. I'm also in the Department of Psychology, and I'm an associate professor, and my area of interest in my work all focuses around understanding and improving teams in a variety of different settings, especially high stress and high demand environments such as healthcare and the military, and also looking at what we call these more complex teams of teams or multi-team systems and their challenges. So I'll give it back to Allison to get us started. I'll talk a little bit more later.
Great. So before we get going, just an overview of what this presentation is going to cover. So we're going to start by talking about just some broad observations about effective teams that may resonate with some of your experiences that you've had working on proposal development teams. We'll talk a little bit about what you can do when you're putting a team together to really set the tone and get started off on the right foot working in a proposal development team. We'll talk about team development interventions. So this gets into kind of the meat of how do you avoid common challenges in your team? How do you address challenges as they occur? And we'll give you some tools that you can use to implement in your own teams, as well as some kind of key citations and places to start if you want to talk about how to implement these team development interventions in your proposal itself. And then we'll talk about, in particular, a couple of very helpful team development interventions, which are team charters and team debriefing. Then we'll talk about a couple of common pitfalls for research teams, so managing conflict, and then starting off with ineffective goals. We'll do a little bit of wrap up and takeaway, and then we'll have some time for Q&A and discussion, although I encourage you to share your questions in the chat. And Marissa and I, as we trade off, we'll keep an eye on the chat for each other and try to keep up with questions there, or feel free to kind of virtually raise your hand or chime in, and we'll try to provide opportunities for that throughout as well. Before I get going, I also want to note that these little orange stars provide key team science citations. So if you are working on writing up a team science component of a grant proposal, these are especially good places to start when looking for information on kind of how to talk about team science, what a team science approach might look like, all those sorts of things. So we've noted those throughout the presentation. So before we dig in, we wanted to get an idea, a kind of read of the room in terms of what best describes your most recent collaboration. So I'll pause for a moment, and you can share in the chat either a 1 if you're lucky nobody got hurt, a 2 if the team was inefficient and draining but you made it, a 3 if your team was productive but socially or intellectually draining, a 4 if it was socially and intellectually satisfying but not very productive, or a 5 if you achieved team nirvana and your team was socially and intellectually satisfying and productive. Okay, it looks like we've got some 3s and 4s. So not the worst, which is great, but still some room for improvement. So hopefully some of the information we will have to share today will be helpful to you in figuring out how do you take your team from maybe productive but draining, or intellectually satisfying but not very productive. How do you take it to the next level where you can achieve both of those things? So a little background on what Marissa and I focus on in our research. So really a driving question behind all of our work is, how do we turn a team of experts into an expert team? So probably a number of you have had an experience putting a grant proposal together where you have top leading experts in the field, and maybe it's an interdisciplinary proposal, and so you have folks who are top of their field from a wide range of disciplines, and then things don't go super well. So the idea here is that your team can be composed of a bunch of individuals who are experts, but it takes something extra. It takes kind of effective teamwork to actually for the team to actually kind of reap the benefits of all of this expertise and to work together effectively to kind of achieve that end goal. We also try to work on identifying meaningful patterns of team dynamics to implement the right interventions. So we'll talk today about team development interventions and thinking about how and why and when we should be implementing these team development interventions. And we take inductive and deductive approaches to implementing in practice, evaluating and improving team science. So how do we turn a team of experts into an expert team? We'll talk about team development interventions in the next section, but I'm going to start us out by talking about kind of the state of science teams, and then some key findings that that have been distilled of things that we know make an effective team. So science teams often underperform. It's really difficult, especially in an interdisciplinary science team, to achieve effectiveness. And it's especially difficult, or especially easy, to underperform when the team lacks a disciplinary core. So when it's truly interdisciplinary and you have maybe one individual from these very different disciplines. When teams are larger, it's easier to underperform. And when teams are made up of many disciplines. So you can see in this graph, teams that are made up of 4 or more disciplines have the hardest time performing. And there are a lot of challenges that make it difficult to perform in an interdisciplinary team, right? So we all have every department has, even within Clemson, has different tenure and promotion requirements that may be exacerbated if you're working with folks who are from across universities. So the types of journals that we aim to publish our grant-funded research in are different. Our methodological approaches are very different. Something that is considered an advanced and innovative method in one discipline might be a little bit considered a little bit archaic in another discipline. We might have differences in work processes. So especially depending on the types of individuals that you collaborate with on a regular basis, there might be differences in how you work together. So when you're working in an interdisciplinary research team, there are all of these additional considerations. So when you're working with folks who are from your own discipline, you come in with what we call a shared mental model about, where should we be publishing this work? What would be considered innovative in this field? And those teams can still be difficult to kind of make work and achieve effectiveness. But when you're coming in with all of these different schemas about what good research looks like, it's even more difficult to find success in your team. So because of this, there is increasing demand to crack the code on team effectiveness. So despite these challenges that interdisciplinary teams have, we know that when individuals work in teams, that's how we come up with our kind of most creative and innovative ideas. And our most successful researchers are working in teams all the time. So how do we crack the code on team effectiveness? How do we take everyone from that kind of 3 or 4 range to that 5 range on how you feel about working with your most recent team? So just quickly, I'm going to go through, I believe I have 10 observations about what effective research teams do, feel, and think. And we'll talk about throughout our presentation, we'll talk about how to implement these. And then we'll also talk about and cite some team development interventions that can help you as you're developing your own proposals. So first, teams have clear roles and responsibilities. And you want to think about roles and responsibilities both in terms of your discipline. So it's very easy on an interdisciplinary grant to say, oh, you're the engineer, so you do the engineering parts, and you're the psychologist, so you do the behavioral parts. But you also want to think about clear roles and responsibilities as they pertain to how you are tackling the grant submission. So maybe you have someone on the team who's really good at that kind of big picture overall pushing the team to decide what parts of the proposal they're going to work on next, has that kind of bird's eye leader's view of what's going on. And then you have someone on the team who's a really strong writer who can kind of go through the whole proposal at the end and make edits and really bring it all together into a cohesive, coherent grant. So thinking about clear roles and responsibilities in multiple domains is important. You all want to be driven by a compelling purpose. So later in the presentation, we'll talk about what effective goals look like for interdisciplinary research teams and how to take your goals from ineffective to effective. It's really difficult when you're coming in, as I mentioned previously, with people from all these different disciplines who have competing goals with each other to really coming together with a common vision and objective. You also want to make sure that your team is guided by leadership who promotes and develops and supports the team's work. A lot of the team development interventions that we'll be talking about today can be used by the leader to enhance their effectiveness with the team. You want your team members to have psychological safety. So psychological safety is a shared sense that it's okay to speak up in the team, that it's okay to say, you know, I don't think that this is the right direction, or are we sure this is how we want to do things? And psychological safety is the biggest influence on psychological safety in the team is the leader. So coming at things with an attitude of, I don't know the best way to do this. What do you all think is the best way to approach this problem? Or with some humility and ability to, admitting to a mistake that you made, saying, you know, I thought this was going to be the best way to approach writing this submission, but I actually think we need to pivot. All those kinds of things can help build psychological safety in your team. You also want to, and we'll talk a little bit about this with our section on kind of getting how to get started working with your team, but you want to develop team norms. So you want everyone to be on the same page about how do we communicate with each other, what does our collaboration look like? You want to hold a shared understanding. So I mentioned this before, or a shared mental model. So you want everyone on the team, even though you're coming from different disciplines who use different language and have different approaches, you want everyone to have a shared mental model of how you're approaching the project that you are all working on together. So ranging from the goals and what the goals what our shared goals related to the project are, what everyone is doing, what everyone's kind of individual goals are to achieve that, and also how are we going about this? Who's taking responsibility for what in developing this grant proposal? You want to be on a team that regularly self-corrects through huddles and debriefs. So we'll talk in this presentation about how to conduct an effective debrief and share some tools for conducting an effective debrief. And we find that these team development interventions really are linked to more effectiveness in the team. You want to set expectations that are clear and understood. So this goes hand in hand with having a shared mental model, making sure that everyone's on the same page about, you know, are we a team that is planning on having everything ready to go, you know, 2 weeks before our deadline to the Office of Research Development, or are we okay, you know, working closer to the deadline? Having clear expectations can help you avoid and manage conflict as well. Number 9, we want to be sharing unique information. So research finds that teams that communicate the most are not the most effective. It's actually teams that are really communicating the most unique information. So that's making sure that you're not spending all of your time in meetings discussing the things you have in common or the things that you all understand and all know, but really what unique information you each individually bring to the table. And this is especially important to kind of maximize the effectiveness of an interdisciplinary collaboration. And then you also want to make sure that your team is, to the extent that you can, supported by optimal conditions. So for example, departments that reward and prioritize working on teams. A lot of these grant funding agencies are now focusing more and more on rewarding interdisciplinary team-based collaboration over individual performance. So those are the types of conditions that can help create team success. Before I move on and hand it off to Marissa, does anyone have any questions about these observations?
So this is Casey. I'm looking at number, for example, 6, 7, 8. Are these aspects which you would explicitly describe as a methodology when you write a proposal? And so, how, for example, how do you do self-correct, or the frequency of that, or how do you describe expectation explicitly in your proposal?
Marissa, I'll let you speak to that first.
Yeah, I think that's definitely what, these are the types of things that and one of the reasons that we wanted to kind of cover these is, these are exactly the types of things to be, if you can demonstrate in the proposal and you can have kind of guidelines and opportunities, and you can show in the proposal how you're doing these things. So yes, how, what way, what methods or approaches or even just, ways that we've taken the time already to ensure that there's a shared mental model. So what techniques and strategies have already being used with the team to demonstrate that, yes, we've had X number of meetings already as a team, and we formulated a shared, a charter that documents all of this. And I'll get into some of the details of what that'll look like. And, and then we're going to have, clear milestones and markers along the way that are teamwork focused, not just task work focused as well. And that those are exactly the types of things that folks who are wanting to see from the funding agency side, they're going to want to see things like that embedded in the proposal and its milestones along the way.
Well, thank you.
Great question.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Then I will pass it off to Marissa for effective beginnings.
Sounds good. Yes. All right. Thanks, Allison. I think that's actually, that's a good question to kind of even jump right into what I'm now gonna kind of go over. So, so for the next little bit, what I want to talk a little bit about is, and we'll get into some of the different interventions and things that also will be good to incorporate into, for example, into grant proposals. I'm going to kind of frame this from the next little while that I'm going to talk is, a lot of it's going to kind of be in the mindset of thinking about forming a grant proposal team, and what are some of that kind of really the best practices to be thinking about and to implement with grant proposal teams. Of course, these will apply to other contexts as well, but I think that is probably the most relevant for the audience today. So so just something to keep in mind as you hear me kind of now talk a little bit about, as we're forming and setting up our teams, we're kind of thinking about those grant proposal teams that might be large teams where a wide variety of folks coming together from a lot of different disciplines or backgrounds with varying levels of experience working with one another. That's kind of the context in which I'm going to kind of use examples and pull from and things I'm going to talk about for the next little bit. So Allison, if you want to go to the next slide there. So like I said, I'm going to get into some of the interventions a little bit later on. But I first want to just kind of get everyone thinking a little bit about when we're going into, and especially when we're going into forming a research team and setting up a research team that's going to be successful, especially when it's really trying to pull together and come up with these truly convergent research ideas and plans and outcomes that in the end no one discipline would be able to solve or address this particular issue or problem all on its own. This can be really difficult and it can be very challenging. And it really takes, it requires taking the time to really work more upfront and spend the time and really put the effort and energy into and thought into planning the team out strategically and having opportunities to really form and work together even before, well before that proposal maybe even goes in, especially if it's a large grant proposal that is a long-term grant proposal, millions of dollars type thing, then you want to really put the effort and the time into forming this team and spending the time to really create the conditions for effective teaming well before you actually submit the proposal, because by the time you get to the proposal submission stage, then if you've taken the time to focus on and build connections and to clearly outline goals, make sure those goals are shared, make sure there's good clear shared understanding of what we're working on together, how we're going to get our work done, the team science aspects will be inherently easy to incorporate. It will be a lot easier to write out a strong management approach that demonstrates a clear convergence strategy and a clear transdisciplinary strategy if you've taken the time up front to kind of work through some of these potential challenges or issues or barriers that we will also talk a little bit later on about. And there are different ways that we can kind of create the right conditions and really set up teams for effective teaming later on, some of which can involve focusing early on making sure that we're picking the right folks with the right expertise. So, and this expertise is about both their ability to contribute to the research goals of a project, for example, but maybe also to contribute to the management aspects. So, do we have someone who is going to be a strong co-investigator, who's going to be able to help really lead and direct and support the PI on this project in terms of managing the different dynamics of the teams that are involved? Do we have folks who are able to help with doing what we kind of call boundary spanning? So being able to kind of work across different disciplines, different boundaries, different areas, different universities that might be involved, really kind of driving that forward. Or do we need to build capacity for that? So is that something where we've got a really great investigator, but maybe they need to spend a little bit of time, as we're working together as a proposal team and as a research team, building up their own capacities, capabilities for teamwork or other knowledge, other expertise. We can also focus on making sure we're setting up the environment and kind of creating the right workflow, the right work design. Maybe we need to restructure or focus our roles and goals a little bit differently to make sure that we've got everything covered. Maybe that we've got all of our aims covered. We've got the right players involved, and we've got the right kind of structure and tasks. We can also focus on really working together as a team, so taking a little bit more of a holistic approach from a teamwork perspective, where we're not just focusing on maybe building an individual member's capabilities or abilities to be a good team bird, be a good co-I or a good PI, but also focusing on how are we all going to kind of work together to build our competencies to work effectively in this team and hopefully in future teams as well. So there's kind of some different strategies and approaches we can take from kind of creating these conditions. But I'm going to talk through a few, especially kind of focusing on this holistic team approach a little bit, in terms of some of the things that we need to really start and think about as we're building and forming and especially getting ready to maybe go after a big grant proposal together or something like that. So if you want to go to the next slide. I think if you click one more time, there we go. Yeah, there we go. So we're setting up kind of a research team, and again, this is where really thinking about what's going to make this type of this unique setting where we're, like I said, often bringing together folks who maybe have never worked together before, or may have a mix of some folks who've had some experience and history working together, but we're all maybe trying to approach this brand new grant proposal submission together, or trying to build a research team that's going to go after this big grant proposal together. We really have to start off on the right foot in terms of setting clear expectations, setting goals that are, again, this may seem like, well, of course, we're all reading the call for proposals. We know what we're supposed to be doing, but what those our clear understandings and our shared mental models maybe are not always there until we take the time to have open conversations about them, to be sure that we're writing them down, that we're creating kind of a shared understanding that is not just PI driven solely, but is incorporating the input from everyone who is going to be part of this team. We also want to focus a little bit on the socialization aspects. So even just laying out and making it clear in terms of, as we're bringing on people to a team, what that's going to look like, what is that process, what resources can we provide, especially if it's someone who's maybe joining a little bit later in the game. How are they going to be onboarded? What all are we going to do to help them get ready to work and collaborate with everyone else? And then also, as Allison mentioned before, this is where kind of really setting the right norms for what is appropriate, what is inappropriate, and being ideally as explicit as possible in these types of, especially research team type environments. I think the more that you can be explicit, the better off you're going to be. So again, this is where really starting to think about and putting effort, intentional effort around clear, goal definition, socialization, and norms is really important for creating proposal teams and research teams that will be successful in the long run. Okay, the next slide. Some of this, like I said, is really focusing on and what we've seen especially seen teams really struggle with sometimes is thinking that either everyone has a shared idea, shared mental model of what the goals and the purpose and outcomes are going to be, but maybe never having that clearly written down, or having joint discussions, joint engagement in that process. And unfortunately, then what we tend to see are groups that may launch right into let's get writing and let's get working on things without having kind of a clear discussion and a clear way of laying out the purpose and the goals of the proposal, or also clarifying what we think everyone's role is going to be in contributing to these goals. So I may have an idea as PI in terms of how I think everyone's going to contribute to the goals that I've laid out for the team, but they may have different ideas, or and if we don't have those conversations, and we don't have those especially cross group conversations and bringing everyone together to discuss these goals, then that's where we may run into problems and issues later down the road, and may struggle with trying to get have I guess good connections across different sub goals or different components of the work that we're trying to accomplish. Okay, can I go to the next one? Yeah. And so kind of feeding into this is taking the time again up front to think a little bit about, okay, what is it going to, especially on research teams, we will have people who come in and out fairly consistently and for a variety of reasons. And that may be if it's a long-term ongoing project where it's just we have grad students who come in or postdocs that come in and then leave. It's the nature of their progression and their programs and their careers. And even in a research proposal team, we may realize that we have a need to add somebody on onto the team later on in the game and close to the deadlines or things like that. And we may have an additional set of goals that we might add or tasks we want to add, and we realize we need an expert to help with those tasks. There needs to be a process in place for clearly bringing those folks into the team so that they know and have a clear understanding of who currently is in the team, what is it that they're going to be doing, how are they going to be expected to contribute, what are the already established connections and relationships and partnerships that might be in place that things that they either need to know in terms of even just something as simple as how are we going to make sure that everybody who we're adding to the team has access to these shared files that that we are working on, that they have access to Box or Dropbox or Google Drive or whatnot. Who's going to be the facilitator for that? Who's going to make sure that we have that information laid out? What are we going to do if someone needs to leave the team? And how do we make sure that we don't have information loss? How do we prevent when you have someone who has been part of a team for a very long time? Sometimes they have a lot of institutional knowledge or a lot of kind of information about this is how things run or this is how I do things that may not be documented. The more that you can write, figure out and have a plan up front for being sure that you have a way to capture that information, that documentation, is a really important part of the teaming process. So both in terms of, it can be easy, I think, sometimes to think about, okay, well, how do we socialize, but also think about if someone's going to exit the team, how are we going to kind of follow through with that process so that we don't lose important information along the way. And this can be especially important for research teams where either taking the time to onboard someone, it takes time, and it can be if it's not done effectively, it can hurt. It will hurt the overall performance and our ability to get the work done in the team. But if we do set up our newcomers with a sense of empowerment, give them some ability to also weigh in and provide their input and really jump in with ideas, suggestions, bringing in their expertise, that the whole reason we sought them in the first place, then they're going to be able to really integrate better and hopefully make the team better in the end as well. And the more that we can really set up both expectations for the newcomer, so setting this person up in terms of letting them know kind of what to expect, and also letting the team know we're bringing this person in for this specific purpose, for this specific reason, and this is what we expect them to contribute. Then that's another important component too. I know I've been on many research teams where sometimes it's all of a sudden there's a new person and it's not always explained fully as in terms of what it is that they're contributing or what it is they're going to be doing, and so that can be confusing and maybe sometimes frustrating for other team members. So I think that's an important component as well for you to think about as you're working on building and developing your teams. Right, we'll go to the next slide. So again, some of the kind of things to think about in the socialization process. Again, kind of spend some time on this because it is such an important element that can be a little bit easy to forget because we get so excited about maybe bringing someone on. But it's really important to think about the different kind of ways and roles and aspects that we want to kind of socialize folks around. So making sure that folks are aware of what it is that they're supposed to be doing, because that's going to help them be more committed to this project, to this group, and then thinking about kind of someone who is going to transition over time. You're not a new member forever, so you're going to eventually become a regular member of the team, and then also being able to kind of think about how to as I'm no longer the newbie on the team, but it now is part of my responsibility to help bring on other people as well. So again, just some things to kind of think about with the socialization aspect. Go to the next slide. And all this kind of helps to build towards really this is the type of thing that your grant writer or your grant funding agencies, they are looking for evidence in your proposal that you essentially have this degree of identity and connection, and what we want to kind of call that entitivity, so the sense of that there's a sense of we haven't just brought a bunch of individuals together and we expect them to individually work on their own to achieve something, but there is this sense of identity fusion, identity connectedness. We kind of call groupiness sometimes is the other way to think about intensivity. And you can, this is why it's not just when we think about adding and integrating team science into a research proposal, it's the proposals that are really strong are the ones where you get a sense of everyone is, multiple people are contributing to the writing, multiple people are contributing to the structure, the goals, the roles, the purposes. It's not just that we are adding a layer of social science into an engineering proposal by tacking on a few pieces at the end. It's that there's clear evidence of essentially this, this sense of group intensivity, that the ideas are truly fusing the two or more areas, and this is going to really produce a more effective proposal and a more effective research project in the end. If you aren't kind of taking the time to do the socialization, if you aren't taking the time to develop goals together, that's where it's going to be much more clear that there's a disconnect between your disciplines, between your fields. So again, this is why it's important to kind of take your time to work together upfront, because it will come through in the writing and it will come through to the funding agencies that yes, we do have this sense of connectedness in our ideas as well as in our structures and plans and how we're going to work together. Go to the next slide. And again, this also can come through with our norms. The norms are also important because it will create the right, especially as Allison mentioned before, we want to kind of work towards and build psych safety in our, especially for research teams, where if we're trying to really encourage folks to think in new ways, think outside the box, speak up and share their maybe what they consider to be very off the wall or non-traditional ideas, non-traditional inputs. The more that you can work towards and really develop and build towards norms for psych safety, which would be doing things such as having leaders speak up and share their own unique ideas or thoughts, or encouraging others to making sure that if there's one quiet person in the group that they're contributing, that they're providing their input, maybe not always calling them out individually, but maybe making sure that there's an opportunity where they do feel comfortable to following up in an email, maybe if they didn't speak it all up in a group meeting, maybe checking in and making sure they're comfortable with sharing and maybe giving them that more comfortable environment to share their ideas or thoughts or contributions. Other things that can also help with kind of building a sense of psych safety is to also provide, encourage through peer support. So again, also kind of as you don't have to be the PI to be the one who's reaching out to others to make sure that that they feel comfortable sharing their ideas, providing their input. And also the more we can kind of create an environment where everybody knows why they're here. They know why they're part of a team. They know what it is they're supposed to be doing. They're going to feel more comfortable speaking up. They're going to feel more comfortable asking questions. If I'm expected to be the expert in one area, or if I'm expected to contribute in a certain way, then I know kind of what it is I'm supposed to be doing. And so therefore I'm going to be able to feel more comfortable maybe bringing up questions about that. Or bringing up concerns around that specific issue. And all of these will lead to better outcomes that will both, again, it will be reflected in the proposal. It will also be reflected in hopefully the ultimate team performance that's going to come out of this successful proposal that you've put together. The next slide there. So one place where all these things can happen in terms of kind of creating, you're doing your socialization, creating your goals, setting your norms, demonstrating your norms, is in meetings. We have lots and lots of meetings, and I've also done a little bit of research here and there about meetings. So also wanted to just kind of discuss a little bit about what are some ways that you can kind of maximize meetings as an opportunity to reinforce these types of norms and goals and socialization opportunities. So although I will always say that my very first question for anyone ever, you should always ask yourself, do we really need a meeting? Anytime that you are about to schedule a meeting, question, double check. If it is information that can be conveyed in some other form, some other medium, can you send it in an email and get the same outcomes? Can you maybe even record a video, have folks watch it and get the same outcome? Maybe you don't actually need that meeting. So these are things to think about, anytime that you're about to have a meeting with the team. If the answer is yes, if there's no other way to convey or to get the tasks done that you need to accomplish, by all means, have that meeting. However, make sure that you have an agenda. That's, I don't have that clearly on here, but that is the inherent underlying thing that is going to, the connecting component that is going to make all the rest of these things happen. So when you are setting up your agenda, you need to think about who's going to facilitate this meeting. Am I the right person to facilitate? Not always. So even if I'm the one calling the meeting, that doesn't mean that I'm necessarily the right one who has to facilitate all or every part of a meeting. It may depend on the tasks that need to be accomplished. It may depend on what it is that we're hoping to come out or come away with, or what updates may need to be provided. So there may actually be someone else who is the facilitator other than the person who's calling the meeting. Make sure you get that plan in place, and you have those folks agreeing that they will be assisting and facilitating. Making sure there are opportunities to socialize a little bit, so that may be a good chance to spend some time with, kind of making sure that folks, if you've got newcomers, folks who have never been a part of the team before, making sure you're doing some introductions, giving some chances to do things like that. not just jumping right into the work itself. Of course, we want to be respectful of folks' times, but time and energies and efforts, but at the same time, a little bit of socializing that can help with reinforcing kind of those opportunities to develop some of the interpersonal aspects of groups are really important. Setting up and having clear kind of norms, rules, and structures for your meetings. Again, that helps kind of reinforce then what the rest of your project might be shaping up to be or might be looking like. So having norms about if you're expected to present something in the meeting or share information in the meeting, and if there's something that you need to share in advance, making sure you get it sent out in advance, enough time for folks to review. If it's something that you're going to review in the meeting, making sure that you're allocating enough time for that review in the meeting, and making sure that you're allocating roles, designating folks who can help with facilitating that in the meeting itself. You also want to think about what's going to happen. Let's say you're going to have a discussion, or you're trying to resolve a problem and reach a solution in a meeting. Well, you may inevitably have some type of conflict. We're going to talk a little bit more about conflict later on, but the more that you can do some upfront planning and anticipation that there will be dissent, and that you need to, how are you going to resolve that? How are you going to address it? And also, how much time are you going to allow for it? You don't want to let your meeting totally be overrun by debates. If that's not the purpose of the whole meeting, then make sure you have some structure in place to help prevent that. Also making sure that there is a kind of wrap up and action items that come out of your meeting. So being able to kind of summarize, okay, what did we accomplish here today, and what are our next steps? Always having action plans, always having kind of to-dos, do-outs, something that I work a lot with military, and that's the key phrase whenever you're working in these types of contexts where if you're having a meeting and you're assigning folks things to do, make sure you summarize those do-outs at the end, and then also following up as needed after the meeting to ensure that you've got that follow-through happening. So just some things to kind of think about. Like I said, everybody has meetings, especially when you're talking about research proposal teams. I'm sure you're having lots of meetings, and so the more that you can provide structure, provide agendas in those meetings, that's going to set your team up for successful outcomes and more efficient meetings as well in the end. So, all right, next one. All right, so I'm going to go a little bit into now probably what some of you are really interested in hearing about is some of the okay, what can we incorporate, what can we do in our proposals to really demonstrate that we're taking the time to to invest in our team, invest in our research team, and develop these convergent research ideas, or develop these team science informed plans for our research and how it's going to be accomplished. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the different, just at a very, very high level, some of the different types of interventions that can be used, kind of some things to think about in terms of how you can potentially combine different interventions together, but then really get into team charters quite a bit, because this is something that is such an important component of, again, kind of really setting up research teams in particular to be successful. The more you can kind of have documentation early on, have a place for your new team members to go to, or for your team members to refer back to when you're working together on the project, on the proposal. The more that you kind of document your process of how we're working together up front in a team charter, you can integrate that into your writing. You can integrate that into your actual proposal, because you've already worked on, and you can also demonstrate that, yes, we've created a plan already, and we've got our norms laid out, we've got our approaches laid out for how we're going to work together, and that helps to make it a little bit easier, I think, for then having a successful proposal that demonstrates effective integration of team science in the write-up of it itself. All right, can we go to the next slide, Allison? All right, yeah, if you just do that real quick, yeah, that works. Okay, so so there are many different types of interventions, and these are the types of things that I think these are some of the key phrases, words, things that if you're looking to integrate, or if you're being asked to demonstrate that you're applying principles of team science in your proposal. Interventions is a really good place to start. Interventions are essentially just any type of kind of clear plan, tool that is going to be used to improve the performance and the functioning of the team. And there can be very successful team interventions. There can be less successful team interventions. I'm going to mention just a few of these here. So team training is probably one of the ones that we recommend the most in terms of it's a very strongly used and it has a lot of clear ties to improving team process, improving team performance. These types of training programs have been used and developed for aviation. They've been developed for healthcare industry, and so that's one area where you can really kind of pull in and say that you're going to maybe integrate or have team members go through a clear team training program to improve individual and group teamwork, knowledge, skills, and abilities. And that's really the target of good team training program, is to have you focus on recognizing, identifying, and understanding kind of the key elements of what makes for a good team, and having an opportunity to both to also practice some of those skills and how to develop them effectively. So that, I think, in and of itself could be something that could be, that we've seen successfully implemented and would encourage folks, especially if you've got folks who have never kind of been exposed to any type of team training before. Those types of programs can be really, really effective. As I mentioned, team charters, I'm going to go a little bit more in detail about that, so I'm not going to get into that right now, but this is really just kind of the documentation that you can come up with and develop to clarify goals and kind of establish the direction and boundaries for your team, and kind of how you're going to really work together, what you're going to accomplish, the nitty-gritty of what it's going to look like. Team debriefing is another one that is also a really great one that I think integrates nicely with team science or with actual science teams, scientific research teams, because when we think about working in a scientific research team, there are, well, we like to think about the big end milestones. Really what we have are a lot of intermediary goals and deadlines and sub goals that we may be trying to accomplish along the way. So the more that we can do some reflecting on every time we have a milestone, every time we have something that we're trying to accomplish and achieve, taking a chance to do what we call a debrief. So just an opportunity to reflect on what we've learned, reflect on what has gone well, maybe what hasn't gone as well, and how we're going to proceed in the future, how we're going to adapt our working. These types of debriefs can be really effective for enhanced performance. Even if we're already doing really well, it can help remind us, okay, these are the things we need to keep doing so that we continue to do well. And like I said, these pair really nicely when, for example, if you're writing up a proposal and you want to demonstrate that you're pulling from the science of good teamwork, integrating debriefing along with every milestone, debriefing opportunities. Every time you hit a milestone, you're also going to take the time to debrief. That's going to be a really effective strategy to integrate into your proposals. And also demonstrates the focus on learning and improving and growing as from a professional development perspective as well. Team coaching is kind of similar to this as another element. Again, something that could also be especially beneficial early on, if it's a relatively young team or new team, in terms of, we are forming this team explicitly for the purpose of this new project, new goal, new purpose. And we don't have a lot of prior work experience together, or we don't really have a lot of prior, some of us have maybe worked together before, but not all of us. Considering team coaching could be another good strategy to integrate into this. Team coaching essentially would be someone who is providing an outside perspective that is not going to, so just like a real, if you think about a football team coach, they're not on the field playing with the players. They're not out there trying to physically help win the game. But what they are doing is they're providing advice, guidance, input, recommendations of what might be good to do next, strategies to consider, strategies to think about, And especially from a team's perspective, they can kind of take a step outside of being so in the weeds of the problems and the some of the nitty-gritty issues that may be going on in the team, and be able to kind of have that more kind of high level view of what could be going on, and provide input, guidance, support from a bigger picture perspective that might be harder for the co-investigators who are in the middle of it to really to see as easily. So again, something to think about, and team coaching is an approach to that you can kind of integrate as much or as little as you need it. So again, teams that are very new, very maybe inexperienced working together may need more coaching early on, whereas teams that have had a lot of experience together may just need an occasional support that could even turn into more of a self-correcting type thing. So kind of the coach showing them how to work together and how to fix certain problems, and then them taking that on and doing it themselves later on. So again, something to consider adding in. The final component would be team building, which is a tricky one because it is probably the one that the term of team building seems familiar with lots of folks, because it tends to get used a lot, especially in popular psychology and pop culture references. Unfortunately, it can be implemented incorrectly. So I think that there's this is where you might see things like let's go do a cooking class together, let's go to an escape room together, and those may have the time and place to do them, to implement them. The idea tends to be here that we're trying to improve our interpersonal process. So we're trying to build relationships, or we're trying to build trust, reduce conflict, that type of thing. The problem is that team building often is not always tied to those interpersonal goals. Don't actually map onto what we're doing in the experience. And so if we do those, let's go to this escape room, and so that we can reduce conflict. Well, if you've ever done an escape room, you can probably guess that that trying to solve a problem under intense time pressure that is not the easiest thing to do, and is probably more likely to induce conflict and create higher levels of conflict, and maybe that will carry over to future performance outside of the escape room. So maybe not the best place for our best opportunity for teams that are maybe already struggling with conflict issues or trust issues. However, they may be more beneficial for other teams that maybe are trying to work on some of their affect or some other issue instead. So so that's something kind of to think about with with these different types of elements. There's some, again, as Allison mentioned, if it's the stars provide resources, we're also happy to provide that actual resource list to share with anyone who's interested as well. We've got those if that might help as well. But all right, yeah, if you want to do the next, there we go. So one thing so somebody who has helped work on a variety of projects and proposals that have involved trying to incorporate elements of team science into the proposals themselves. One thing that I always recommend is to not simply assume that we're going to take one approach and apply it the same way throughout the entire duration of the process. And I also recommend that you don't have to always it doesn't always require a super difficult, complex problems don't always require very complex solutions when it comes to the teamwork aspects. So first, like I said, we want to think about adding in and essentially trying to think about incorporating different types of interventions at different times of the period of performance. So this over here on the left gives you kind of an example of, you may have a team that is kind of going through different goals, different aspects of their proposal, their project they're working on. And they may, at the very beginning, create a team charter. And so that's their first team development intervention there. So for team one, you see that purple box early on. And so they may create their team charter, they may start working together, and then they may do a check-in on their performance. They may have a coach that maybe steps in, or they may have someone else that, something else that they decide to implement, a little later on in the project. So let's say they've accomplished their first set of aims and they're working on the second set of aims in their project. And they may have some support integrated there. And then maybe also a debrief before they move into the final stage of the project. So that could be one example of how to incorporate maybe just a few. And this doesn't have to be that depending on your resources, availability, interest in and need for these types of interventions. Sometimes starting off with a really strong intervention to start with, like a team charter, can set you up for success where you may not even need as many interventions later on. But it's good, I think, to kind of incorporate kind of these multiple types of interventions at different stages of projects. Again, these are the types of things to look that will be looked for by funding agencies when you're working on a proposal. Not just that you're going to do one thing one time, but are you integrating throughout the duration and the life of the project? Other teams may require, there may be more intensive needs, and so another example might be that in this in this team 2 example, there may be for both these at different outcomes, after different outcomes every single time they're doing debriefs, and then prior to the next round of working together, maybe they're going to spend some time doing some team training or implementing some other type of team coaching or some other strategy that might be necessary to help support them. So in this case, you may have a team where they've got at every cycle, every point of the cycle, almost some type of intervention they're going to be doing, and that's also perfectly acceptable. But those are probably going to look like different types of interventions. You're not going to apply the same exact thing every single time. We're not going to be doing team building 6 times in this team 2 example. You might have, like I said, debriefs and then some type of team building or team training, followed up by some type of maybe coaching or performance assessment or evaluation, feedback along the way. So again, different strategies that may depend on the resources and time and efforts and even the goals. Different teams may require different degrees of intervening or plans for intervening because of the amount of experience coming in. If you've got a highly experienced team, then maybe you need fewer interventions that will have to happen. If you've got a team that's newer, maybe more interventions, or if you may have a lot of changing in and out. So this team 2 example, maybe a team where we're expecting a lot of turnover for various reasons, and so we're going to need some more supports and resources to go along there. So something to think about in your plans. You're creating your kind of plans for incorporating team interventions into your proposals from a team science perspective. Again, the other thing I want folks to think about is that this doesn't have to be a super complex solution every single time either. So if you see over here on the right, this is a solution of in surgeries. Often it can be difficult to keep track of who all is in the room. Seems like it should be a pretty straightforward thing to do. You wouldn't think there'd be as much people coming in and out, but there really can get kind of confusing sometimes. Having gone and observed, sometimes you can start to kind of lose track of who all's in there. So one of the solutions that has come up from and has been looked at is let's just put people's names and roles on their caps, so that you don't have to even ask a question. You instantly know who someone is. And this is a pretty, it's one of those solutions where it's like, oh, well, why hasn't this been done? Like, why wasn't this already a solution early on? But it doesn't take a lot of resources, effort, time, but it will potentially save a lot of headaches and heartaches down the road. So don't always have to think extremely complex. You just have to think about what's appropriate for the situation that you are in, for your team, and what's going to get you to the goals that you're trying to achieve. What is going to help you reduce conflict, confusion, what's going to help to improve communication later on. So just something to think about. So as I said, I wanted to, that's kind of the highlights, kind of high level overview of some of the different ways that you can think about different resources for improving and kind of integrating those into your proposals. But I'm going to go now into team charters in a little bit more depth, because these, I think, are really, I encourage every single research proposal team, every single research team to create these, and then also sustain them for the benefit of your team's life cycle. So as long as your team is working together, you should have some type of charter, I think, because these are really tied to improved performance, and they're not that difficult to do. All right, if you want to go to the next slide, Allison. So what is team charter? Well, it's a literal document that is created by the team members. This isn't just something that the PI creates or the PI and co-PIs create. It should involve input from all team members. And it focuses on providing a clear direction for the team. What are the boundaries of the team? So who would be included or not included in the team? What are all of our roles and responsibilities? And then what are those norms that we're going to use for how we're going to communicate? How are we going to make sure that information is getting conveyed? What is it that, how are we going to work together effectively? And the next slide. At a very basic level, and you can go in as much or as I would say err on the side of more is better when it comes to team charters. You don't want to overwhelm. In the end, if you have a really detailed team charter, that might be a little bit intense for a new person coming into the team to try and digest. But it also is very helpful for the more that you can kind of convey in a document, the less you have to spend time going back over and reminding each other of, oh wait, what did we decide on how we're going to do this, or how we're going to share information, or who's going to lead meetings, or that kind of thing. So at the bare minimum, including who's actually on your team. Again, with big project teams, this can be a really important resource, because having names and contact information for each person, so that if you have a question and you've got someone that you need to try and figure out a quick solution, clearly knowing who to contact and who, having that information on hand in one spot is very important. Having clear idea of, so to include making sure you have all the roles in terms of key duties, responsibilities for every person who is part of the team, laying out any supervisory, subordinate relationships. So what does your chart, your organizational chart look like for this project team? Who might you need to go to if you have a question that you can't get a hold of one person, and maybe you need to get a hold of their supervisor? That having this documented out will make it a lot easier for you to be able to do that when it comes to deadlines and that type of thing. Having clear rules in terms of how you're going to share information with each other, and this can be as simple as, like I said, even just something as basic as we're all going to use this type of shared drive or this type of shared document. Or this is where the proposal is going to live online. Having that is really important. And again, it may seem really straightforward and easy, but not all teams have that written down, and it's important to make sure there is a place to have that shared. And then also the other kind of other components here is to think about what are the other requirements that we may have, any rules for reporting or documenting information. I would also say, something that's not on here, but what I would encourage folks to do is to also make sure you have kind of a plan for how often or how frequently you might plan to revisit and update this team charter, because teams change and you need to make sure that you have an opportunity to revise and a regular check-in for that. All right, go to the next slide. When do you need a team charter? Well, ideally, you would start one as soon as your team is working together, as soon as you start to form a team. So if you've identified that, yes, we're going to do a research proposal together, or even just, we're trying to kind of develop ideas around, and we're going to start a research project that we hope will lead to, with the goal of maybe we don't have a specific grant proposal we're going for right now, but we want to form this partnership because we think it's going to be really important. We're going to start a collaboration together, and we want to start to kind of outline that a little bit. So this could be, so like I said, as soon as you start working together and kind of forming your team, then that's really the point. Or if you already formed your team, but you don't have this, then they can get one in place as soon as you can. All right, can we go to the next? So why are these important? Why am I kind of making sure that we're spending a significant amount of time talking about team charters in particular? Well, because they can really help set up teams for success later on. So they really help to define the conditions and also point out where there might be areas that are lacking So this may be an opportunity to say, okay, well, what is it that we're missing? What is it that we thought that we had expertise, or we thought that we had this role covered, but actually we don't. We need someone else who can help do this. And sometimes it can even point out, even just basic gaps of, oh, wait, do we have someone who's going to help make sure that we, that we are having meeting notes taken in our meetings? Are we making sure that we have someone who's going to be able to connect with this particular agency or organization that we want to get involved or engaged? Having that documented out can, like I said, help both identify where we already have our connections and where we may need to build new ones or incorporate or bring in new members. It can also help make sure that everybody has a clear understanding of what it is that we're doing, what it is that we're working on, what's our purpose, what are our goals. It might help to identify, again, kind of what, where do we have gaps, maybe also where do we have hidden strengths in our team. So like I said before, that idea of maybe highlighting, oh, well, we've got our PI is great at handling some of the all the task aspects of managing the team, but maybe we need to make sure that we have a co-PI or two who can step up and help manage some more of the teamwork aspects. So maybe we need someone who can manage the team science aspects or manage those types of things. So and then also really being able to get a better sense of what everyone is bringing to the table. So what if this is a brand new group where some folks have extensive collaboration history together and others do not, even just knowing who has collaborated before and who hasn't, this is one place that you can do that and start to kind of lay out those expectations overall. Can we go to the next slide? So I think maybe for the sake of time, we won't go into a break. So I want to make sure folks have time to answer or ask questions and things in a little bit. But if you would like to, and I would encourage everyone, I think this is a great resource here. This itpmetrics.com is a website that's created by a collaborator, friend of ours, Tom O'Neill. He's at the University of Calgary, and he has a great set of resources that are all free, including team charter templates. Yes, perfect. Allison got in there for us. This is just kind of, again, gives this example here is not a team science or a research team specific example, but it gives kind of just the types of elements that you would want to pull in. So having your purpose, the scope, the duration, time committed project, what's our end result, what resources do we have, what's our plan for reporting, what are our deliverables, what are other resources that we may want to make sure that we're connecting into this document that's shared. As I said, the ITP metrics charter template and other resources are also available there too, that you can go into and explore and start to kind of create your own team charters for your own projects. I would strongly suggest, just even if you don't have a current proposal or something that you're working on right this minute, that even any team that you're part of, you could apply this this team charter to. I have all my students do this in teams. If you are teaching a class that involves group projects, if you want to save yourselves a heartache and headaches and many emails from students, I found team charters to be one way that is really great to get students off on the right foot, as long as you have them, and as long as you are actually giving them feedback on those charters in terms of forcing them to think through the roles, forcing them to not just say, oh, well, we'll figure out who's going to do this, or we're all going to share responsibilities. No, you're not. Figure it out now. Figure it out up front in terms of what that's really going to look like. Who is truly going to take on the task of submitting this particular component of the project. All of these things, even if it seems kind of time consuming early on, it again is worth the time up front because it will reduce the number of problems and issues later on. And this is true for both, like I said, both student project teams as well as research teams and proposal teams and that type of thing. So if you want to go to the next slide, just want to hit quickly on kind of wrap up a little bit with one other type of intervention that I think is really important to focus on, and that's to consider doing debriefs. again, there's a reference up here on the right to a tool called Debrief Now. This has been created by, unfortunately, this one is not a free resource, but it does provide some good evidence-based approaches and strategies. I think there's maybe a white paper that we can probably share and provide to workshop attendees afterwards, that was created by the folks who made Debrief Now. But the purpose of doing debriefs is to focus on really the process improvement aspects. So this is, these are informal information exchange and feedback sessions where after you have worked together, you've had some episode of performance together. So like I said, for a research team, this might be, we just finished, a deliverable, we just finished, it doesn't have to be waiting until we're turning in a yearly report. But it could be, and would be more actually better suited to, okay, we just finished accomplishing this component of the project that was, we reached this, we completed this set of subtasks, or we completed this particular sub goal. Let's do a debrief for the folks who are involved in that to see what we did well. What was the process? What did it look like? If things went wrong, why did they go wrong? If things went well, how did they go well? And what do we need to make sure that we're either continuing to do the next time, or that we are maybe changing or not doing, so that we can be better off in the long run. So can we go to the next slide there? So just some tips for these. Good debriefs ideally are going to, again, if you've got kind of that psychological safety in place where folks feel comfortable sharing and providing their input, their ideas, then you're going to get better information, you're going to get more accurate information, more honest information, and you're going to get more actionable information. If you are in a team, or if you are trying to conduct a debrief and you are not sure if you have this level of psych safety, what I would recommend doing is having have some type of outside facilitator. And really, even overall, it can be very beneficial to have a facilitator who is not either at least not the leader of the team, or does not have a specific, there's not a power structure in place where that person would have power over other members in the team, their role in the team. To be, have someone who is not in the power structure to facilitate, because that's going to, again, help you get more honest, open input. And also consider using something like doing an anonymous survey or something like that, where you can solicit input, provide, get information, get examples from folks, without them feeling that they are being judged or blamed, or finger pointing. That kind of thing is what you really want to avoid in these types of situations. You are focused on learning in a good debrief. So that is the key thing to take away from this, is that if you're going to conduct debriefs, then make sure the focus is always on the learning component, not the, we want to figure out who did this wrong. And it's really kind of that issue. And
so, Marissa,
yes, yeah.
From that perspective, do you encourage anonymous feedback as part of this?
Yes. So what I've seen be successful, I think this is what a good strategy is to start with an anonymous survey, and then that will provide the information that will fuel the facilitated session. So have a facilitated session, ideally like an in-person discussion debrief, with the appropriate team members who are involved. But provide them with a chance before coming into that environment to share some feedback and thoughts anonymously. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. And then that way too, it helps you structure that, that type of feedback will help you to structure what it is that we need to focus on, because even if the best way to do it is to use someone who is part of the team, and that maybe, just logistically, resource wise, maybe what happens, then there may be things that you think is really important as a PI or co-I, that by getting feedback, you may start to realize, oh, well, maybe that is less of an issue than I thought. And so I'm going to, structure our agenda for our debrief a little bit differently based on, other feedback. Or there may be things that come up that you didn't realize, were problems that you may want to spend more time on because half the team commented about this being an issue. So that's something else to kind of think about in terms of soliciting feedback up front, prior to the session, can help you structure the topics to be discussed during the debrief. And then also it will help to provide that chance to maybe get the most open and honest feedback as possible. And then also kind of focusing on, spending some time in the session, kind of making sense of what was going on, what were the issues. Again, having a facilitator who can help make sure that the discussion is productive and open, and again, not about pointing fingers and blaming one another, and that the reflection is the major goal here, is that we're trying to reflect and learn from the experience, and move forward in a positive way. Again, based on both what are we doing really well that we want to continue doing, because sometimes it can be easy to forget those things, and then what is it that we need to maybe stop doing or change how we've been doing it so that we can move forward and maybe have a better plan or a better strategy as we go into our next round of working together. All right. Now I think I'm going to hand it back on over to Allison, who's going to talk a little bit about the fun pitfalls of working in teams, and then wrap it up for us, and we'll have some opportunities to answer questions hopefully here at the end.
Yes, so I'll be talking, or I'll be kind of wrapping up by talking about a couple of common pitfalls, conflict related, and then goal setting. So both of these kind of intertwine with some of the team development interventions that we've talked about, some of the kind of conditions for team performance that we talked about before, and I'll try to leave about 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. So the first very common pitfall that we see in teams is issues around managing conflict. And at the bottom, you see a meta-analysis that provides some of the kind of latest info, or some synthesizes our research knowledge on team conflict. But it's important to, the big takeaway related to team conflict is that team conflict is inevitable and healthy. So the idea here is not to get rid of conflict. You want people to be, in teams that have no conflict, you may be engaging in groupthink. There may be a leader who's so domineering that no one wants to speak up. So it appears that everyone agrees, but that's not actually, and maybe everyone does agree, but that's not actually getting us to the best solution or the best approach to our project. So the idea here is not to reduce or eliminate conflict, it's to make sure we have the right kind of conflict in our teams. So when we think about managing conflict, this figure provides kind of a useful way of thinking about or of thinking through conflict. And on the x-axis, you see concern for others. So, and on the y-axis, you see concern for self. And our goal really here is that we're compromising. So we're coming out somewhere in the middle, or maybe we're integrating our ideas together. So what we don't want to do is to go into a conflict only focused on getting the best outcome for ourselves. But we also don't want to be so overly concerned about kind of letting others have their way that we don't speak up and advocate for what we have to bring to the table in our project. So talking through kind of what conflict management looks like before your team has any conflict, during and after. So when we think about managing conflict before it occurs, these are really good things to think about and lay out in your team charter, and to maybe talk about in your grant proposal as part of your charter process, was that you discussed how you would manage team conflict. So determining how you are going to approach conflict, whether you're going to seek insight from an outside facilitator, whether you're going to call a meeting when there's conflict about something, how you're going to engage with conflict in your team is important to spell out from the beginning. You want to anticipate potential points for conflict, and especially maybe points that you want there to be conflict. So for example, when you're discussing a new idea or figuring out an approach for part of the project, you may want to have to kind of facilitate conflict, and maybe that happens through a a meeting or a discussion that's explicitly focused on having a discussion about the best way to approach a task. You want to create plans for reducing conflict. So thinking about, making sure that your goals, for example, are shared amongst team members and are spelled out before you start working, or at the outset of working together, because having kind of goal clarity, process clarity, all these things that we talked about related that you develop in the team charter, all of that helps us reduce conflict later on. And then speaking up when you see conflict emerging. So before things get to the point of no return, you really want to be addressing them early on when you start seeing signs of conflict. I think something important to note here as well is that when we think about, typically as teams researchers, when we think about what healthy conflict looks like and what unhealthy conflict looks like, healthy conflict is when we're debating about the tasks that we're working on. Unhealthy conflict is when we just don't like each other, or when we have huge disagreements about how we should go about kind of doing things in the processes in our team. So you want to be having conflict about ideas, not about people or processes. So you may have done kind of some things at the outset of your project, or you may not have, and then conflict inevitably occurs within your team. So how do you address the conflict once it occurs? So this might involve separating the people from the problem. So this is thinking about how do we separate that relationship conflict from the task conflict. So really focusing on the task or the problem at hand, and not what we think about the other people on the team or our frustrations with each other. Focusing on shared interests. So bringing back, maybe we look back on the team charter that we developed when we started working together, where we laid out our shared goals and where we laid out our shared agreement about how we were going to go about pursuing this grant proposal or executing the grant activities. You want to think about developing multiple options for solving the problem. So kind of laying out different alternatives for the team members to discuss and agree upon. And then as objectively as possible, evaluating the options. And this is another scenario where, as Marissa mentioned with debriefing, it might be useful to bring in an external or an outside facilitator just to give that neutral third party viewpoint and approach to help the team members see things more objectively. And then after a conflict has hopefully been resolved, this is a good opportunity to hold a debrief, to talk about how did this conflict emerge in the first place. Maybe we didn't talk about clearly enough in our team charter how often we were going to have meetings, and someone keeps calling meetings every week and they're useless and they're frustrating people, and then we have a disagreement and debate about how often we should be meeting that causes conflict and maybe that causes us to be upset with each other in other facets of the project. So having that discussion about how did this occur in the first place and what could we do to prevent similar conflicts in the future. And then determining what actions we're going to take to prevent the same conflict from occurring. So if we have these disagreements about how often we're meeting, establishing explicit guidelines for when we are going to call a meeting, how we're going to meet, when we meet, all of those types of things. And this is where, once again, I keep talking about the team charter, but that's why that is such a valuable tool, is because it gives you an opportunity, a facilitated opportunity to talk through all of these things that at the beginning of a project when you're working together seem kind of like minutia or seem like they might not matter, but these are the types of things that bubble up into those bigger problems as the project goes on. And so when you're writing up your grant proposal as well and trying to speak to team science and how you're integrating team science, you can talk about, well, what exactly will be contained in your charter and how that will help you, manage conflict down the road or address these different issues that may arise with your team. Okay, the other pitfall that we wanted to touch on that teams tend to struggle with is having ineffective goals. And so you may have heard of a SMART approach to goals, which is research backed. A lot of times, or that's not always the case, but in the case of goals, the kind of most common acronym is supported. But this is a little bit of a meta acronym here. So what we want to think about, especially in an interdisciplinary research team when we're defining our goals, is delineating a greater purpose, setting objectives and key results, aligning the individual and team goals, looking at progress, and then taking this SMART approach. And I'll go through what each of these look like through an example as well. But the goals are thinking about establishing effective goals is important, not only in thinking about your research, but also thinking about how are we working together. And this is another thing that having that team charter discussion at the beginning of working together is a great opportunity for forming these goals. And then when you're debriefing or when you're engaging in other team development interventions along the way, you can go back to what were our shared goals when we started out? Have those changed? Are they still the same? But having clear, well-defined, effective goals from the outset really helps, pays dividends down the road. So the example scenario that we're going to go through to kind of talk about this framework is a team of experts from psychology, human factors, and engineering are working on a grant proposal on the topic of human-robot teams and their effect on organizational performance. The team sets the goal of coming up with as many good ideas on how to test this relationship as possible, and each team member tries to come up with ideas for the grant that make them look intelligent. The leader compiles the great ideas into the grant narrative without giving the team an opportunity to review and discuss the ideas and how they fit with the overall team and grant goals. As a result, the final grant is filled with ideas that don't fit well with each other, are contradictory, sometimes redundant, and don't fully address the overarching objectives of the funding agency. Unsurprisingly, the team does not get the grant. It's easy to look at another or an example scenario and see that it's clear that this team didn't get the grant. But this type of situation where we don't have kind of shared and integrated goals is really common. So we're going to walk through with that framework that I just provided how we could improve, how this team could improve their goal setting. So the first part of this acronym is greater purpose. So in this case, the team needed to come up with a kind of greater superseding goal. So each of the individual members of the team had their own ideas about what should be included in the grant, but we didn't have that kind of integrating goal that brought them all together and gave us a shared purpose. And that shared purpose is what makes us a team in the first place versus just a group of people who are completing a proposal. Becoming a team is about that shared goal, that shared understanding of the shared goal that we have. Next, thinking about objectives and results. And so, once you have this greater purpose, once you have this overall goal, you really need to clarify the objectives and results that are necessary to achieve this goal. So this is kind of about coming up with sub-goals, sub-objectives for each team member to carry out, and then talking through what those objectives look like, making sure team members are in agreement about those objectives, and talking about potential obstacles to achieving those objectives. Then you want to think about aligning individual and team goals. So it's not a bad thing to have individual goal or for individuals within the team to have goals. And that is the idea is that you don't want them to contradict with the team's goals, and you want them to support and facilitate the team's goals. So we think about a goal hierarchy in teams. So we have this overarching goal that everyone in the team is supporting, and then each individual team member has an idea of how they fit in with that overarching goal. And they might have additional kind of goals on the side, maybe professional development skills that they're hoping to get out of this grant, but all of that, all of their goals are aligned and none of them contradict or conflict with the overarching goal of the project. So for example, you don't want to have any team member to have the mindset of, you know, I'm only being concerned about what they as an individual are getting out of the grant. Then goal setting, we want to think about goal setting as an ongoing process. So a lot of the idea behind team development interventions, and Marissa shared the kind of model of, you know, team development interventions happen throughout a team's life cycle, and they need to be kind of tailored to the team. And similarly, goal setting is not about, you know, oh, we had a team charter discussion when we started, when we wrote up this grant proposal, and we're never going to talk about our goals again. You need to continue to talk about goals and reflect back, think back, have our goals changed? And if they have not changed, are we engaging in activities that help us achieve those goals? And then taking a smart approach to writing up your goals, which you all may be familiar with this one. You want to be specific about what your goals entail. The goals need to be measurable, so you need to have some outcome that you can. It's better to say, you know, or to think about things that are, instead of saying, oh, we want to have a good manuscript out of this project, talk about specifically what a good manuscript looks like. How do you measure that? So maybe defining the type of journal that you would like to publish a manuscript in. While it may sound great to have like lofty, huge, world-changing goals, you really want your goals to be attainable. Otherwise, they're not going to be motivating because everyone knows that you can't actually achieve them. This kind of it ties hand in hand with having realistic goals. So you want to make sure that you have realistic goals and a realistic timeline for achieving those goals. And then, which ties hand in hand with goals being time bound. So you want to start from the beginning about thinking about, okay, what is the time frame that we're trying to get this done in? And when we think about the tasks and the objectives that we have to hit to achieve these goals, do we realistically have the time to do so? So just a few takeaways. So one big takeaway is that there is a science to team development intervention. So when you are writing up the team science portion of a grant and talking about how your team's going to work together, there are citations which were sprinkled throughout this presentation, and there's a science to this. It's not just about, you know, going to an escape room and having fun together. And that's not what teamwork is. There's an approach, and there's a lot of different kind of concepts and considerations to bring in. Selecting the right interventions for your team is critical. And so we chose to talk about team charters and team debriefing today because those are fairly implementable and also fairly universal, but you want to think about your team in particular and what your team might need in terms of team development interventions. You are probably going to need multiple interventions throughout the lifespan of your project. You want to think about the timing of those interventions. So it doesn't make sense to debrief before you start working together. There's nothing to debrief about, for example. So thinking from the outset about how we're going to fold in and integrate team development interventions along the way. And then finally, team development interventions can only be successful if teamwork is rewarded and reinforced appropriately. So you don't want to encourage the members of your team to have individual kind of performance objectives or something like that. You want to be encouraging. You want to be working in a context where teamwork is valued and rewarded. So some final these first 5 bullets are really for your own reflection. So thinking about your own teams and your own teamwork. But we also wanted to provide this as an opportunity in the last kind of 15 minutes or so to help you all and answer your questions about what you may need related to your teams.
This is Casey again.
Yes.
A lot of the process involving the team monitoring and then deciding that team intervention. I think that's really great. I learned a lot from the talk today. I wonder whether that's a function that's deeply integrated with project management. I've been involved in a current NSF project led by Renzi, UNC Chapel Hill, and they will dedicate the project management teams to basically embed in our ongoing activities. And on one hand, they do all the program reporting, so they will collect facts along the way, but they also come in and facilitate some of these harder, more complex discussions. So any thoughts on how to best guide Clemson researchers to build up such a structure?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think project management, and in terms of the exact tools available, Marissa might have more to say on this, but I'm not an expert in all specific tools. But when I talk to folks who are coming at things from a project management perspective, there is a lot of overlap with these teamwork concepts. And a lot of what makes project management effective is that they are, even without using the same language, they're using these team concepts. So I think about, for example, talking to software engineers who do a daily stand-up with their team, where everyone just quickly, it takes 10 minutes and everyone quickly shares what they're working on that day and any roadblocks that prevented them from moving as far forward as they expected to the day before. And that's really about a shared mental model, right? So getting everybody on the same page and about our goals and what everyone on the team is doing to work toward their goals. I think the same thing is true with having people talk about having sprints where you maybe work for a couple of weeks at a time. And before you start working on a sprint together, you a lot of times will engage in some kind of goal setting process and say, this is how much time I think this is going to take me, kind of everything that we just talked about with goal setting. And then after the sprint is over, you have some sort of debrief where you talk about, okay, this is what went well. This is why we didn't get as far on this part of the project as we expected to, all of that. Does that get at what you're asking?
Yeah, I think I think it's just echoing that observation. I feel. Yeah. So one thing, for example, you point out an important element in every meeting is to have an agenda. Mm-hmm. That was actually an ad hoc concept for me in my earlier part of career until I started to work with an institution that actually has such a program management resource. Before every meeting, every team meeting, and we're highly distributed nationally. There are 5 institutions. Regularly, we meet every week, and there's the staffing that help us set up that agenda, make sure that we have an agenda before every meeting coming into it. And then along the way, as we are deliberating of all our observations in the progress, there will be note takers. And point out important questions as they're trying to type down notes, and they will say, "Oh, well, something is not clearly conveyed. Can you explain?" Right? And through that process, actually, a lot of the important discussions come out. So
yeah, I think also being able to use folks who are more in that project management role as yes, like debrief facilitators and things like that, as you mentioned, that provides that more of a little bit more of that outside perspective, familiar with the project in terms of knowing enough in terms of the structure and how things are working to be able to to effectively really facilitate that. So I think that that's, tying in and weaving in project management, especially specific dedicated staff and team members who will help facilitate aspects of project management, tying that, marrying that to the team science elements is a really, really good strategy, I think, for sure.
So I'm curious, from the team coaching perspective, is that such a role where you both as experts in this area, are you frequently participating in projects like as a team coach? And if so, what are some typical things that you start with? Do you help, for example, guide them on developing their team charters, for example?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's something that that I've definitely worked with teams on, and I think especially from from regular assessments, evaluation, providing feedback opportunities. That's something that I do with some teams regularly in terms of doing assessments, brief, quick assessments, or other methods to collect information about kind of how the team is performing, also subjectively and objectively, and then providing feedback and mechanisms and opportunities to help them discuss and really focus on how do we improve, how do we get better, or even or providing specific recommendations, advice, guidance based on good science and practices. Those are things that we definitely have, or at least I know I've worked on those, and I think Allison's got some experience with that as well. So
Yeah,
I think depending on the scope of the I think too, it depends on the scope of the team and the project that having either having someone who is a dedicated team science person to help facilitate and also help to maybe even drive some research, driving research in that area. I think that's one thing that I try to look for, though, is that if I can help and also be able to learn more and help to understand more about the work of these types of teams, and to help build better future interventions. That's kind of usually my underlying goal. And when I usually say yes to things is whenever it's that we can kind of really offer both those things at the same time. So helping both the research and the practice side of things.
So probably following up on that thought is it sufficient to have, for example, faculty as yourself on the team, or is it critical to have, in addition to that, actually have a staff type of person to provide that kind of function?
I really think I think if the budget allows, then really having both is what's going to be best, to have both the expert guidance and kind of here's the current best state of the science, best practices coming from kind of the faculty side, paired with here are the folks who can implement that, because I think that's where it can be easy to run short on time and maybe not be able to get into as much detail, or maybe dedicate quite as much time as a faculty member is in some of the implementation aspects, where having dedicated staff who, as long as they're willing to work and kind of understand the value and the value add, the contribution of the team science aspect, then and can implement it, then that's really the best combination there.
It can be helpful to think about some of these concepts as, for example, team coaching behaviors or these project management, team management behaviors. And they can be done by someone within the team, but it's going to take time and effort and intentionality, but they can also be done by an outside facilitator. So depending on the scope of the project, the scope of the budget, all of that can help you determine what exactly that looks like, but you don't necessarily have to hire an external coach to engage in team coaching behaviors and to help your team develop their goals, to help your team manage conflict, all of that. So that's kind of how I think about it.
Yeah. And sometimes I think it's about setting up the teams, early on. So maybe it's that there are more resources kind of built in the front end to help get the team up and going, and then kind of teach some of these also, maybe spending some time doing, like a teamwork training workshop or things like that, where just having kind of an expert facilitator help with that, and then have regular check-ins or other interventions that are kind of planned, but with the goal of maybe trying to make those self-sustained in the team, again, kind of depending on the budget and the resources available for that. But that could be another strategy too, to kind of kind of think about integrating.
Sure. And I think it's just assuming that budget allows.
Yeah.
It's really oftentimes is we don't really know where to look for that kind of personnel with that expertise. And so in the Renzi example, I had an opportunity a few weeks ago to ask them, like, how did you come up with these kind of resources? And they said that when they stood up the research institute, that was one thing the director made an explicit point to say that he believed that's the most important resource to an institute. And then he created an operation where they are not really looking for project management expertise. They are not looking for those certifications, but rather looking for people who are dynamic and agile. They can work in multiple different type of projects and provide those kind of resources. So I think it's really, I'm curious whether in this field, there are, for example, like proposal editing service, there are some of those operations out there. They are open for hire, but are there such open for hire resources for embedding in team projects for this kind of functions? Or is it something Clemson, perhaps this is a Sheila question, whether we should start to grow such a team?
Yeah, and I have started to see, I know like over at UGA, they a couple of years ago started investing in, and they have a whole team science program now that is, exactly kind of what you described in terms of providing additional resources that are specific for kind of both developing skills and providing input and support. But there's a systematic approach that they've taken to, I think, especially trying to focus on a teamwork training and kind of a leader, a PI, early career PI focus. I've also seen, I think maybe Duke, I believe, also has a similar type of team science element to their proposal and grants office, and so I've seen that, and then there are also, there's a in, I think it's Interdisciplinary Science of Team Science organization has, I believe that the last conference they had, that they shared a list of some different folks who do specialize in team science workshops and writings and things like that too. So as an additional resource as well. Of course, I think it'd be, I would love to see, and very excited to see if we could do some more at Clemson, and then, but there are also, I think, some experts who do that specifically that could be brought in as consultants as well. Looks like maybe Sheila has some thoughts there.
Going back to Casey's comment, this is one of the reasons we're doing these workshops with Melissa and Allison. We did one last year and then one this year, and over the summer, they did one with our ADAPT, our EPSCoR Track 1 team also. So, we're trying to provide the resources. Casey, I know you're well connected to the president and provost. Feel free to suggest that Office of Research Development needs to incorporate this, and we need more positions to be able to do that. And I'm happy to help make that happen if we get those positions.
Yeah.
Sure. Thanks.
That'd be great. Otherwise, I think that's wraps it up on our end.
Well, thanks so much. We do appreciate y'all doing this today. I think this was really informative for everyone, I hope. It certainly was for me, even though I'd seen the workshop last year. I still find it useful to, have the more applied talk that y'all gave today with some more of those resources. So for everybody who's on the call, please respond to the survey, give us feedback, because that does help us in the Office of Research Development think about resources going forward and what other kinds of workshops you might want to see. But do appreciate everybody showing up today and the questions and comments in the chat. And we look forward to seeing y'all at our next one, which is then, Jane, what is that? That's yours on the Career Academy.
It's next Wednesday.
Yeah, so if you're interested in a NSF Career Academy and learning more about that program, please come to our workshop next week. But thanks, everybody. We appreciate it. And let us know if y'all have any questions. And thanks again, Marissa and Allison. We do appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.